Greetings and welcome to the last of the mini lectures on this particular page. I'm going to get back to the notion of political development and modernization. In the previous mini lecture, I concluded by talking about what I believe is the first crisis that nations encounter on their journey to becoming a stable nation state. And the first, remember, was the crisis of identity, and simply the crisis of identity is exactly what its name implies. How do people under a political regime describe themselves? For example, in the United States, even though we have a significant political divide in our country right now, uh, the people on all sides are calling themselves loyal Americans. We identify ourselves as Americans, even though we have profound differences in terms of what direction that we should go. Remember, I told you that I believe the U.S. Civil War was a war of identity. There have been many others. The Biafran War, for example, would be another example of a crisis of identity. The Yugoslavian Civil War that resulted in the disintegration of that country was another example of a crisis of identity. The second is the crisis of legitimacy, and I've spoken about this one a bit earlier. Legitimacy is a sense on the part of the public that the government in power has a right to exist. You can disagree with the government on particular policies and still view it as legitimate. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about what's going on in the United States right now is that there are a significant number of people who do not believe that Joe Biden won the presidential election. They do not see him as legitimate. And frankly, I think they're wrong. But remember, politics is about perception. It's not about reality. And the fact that there is a significant number of people who believe that the election was not legitimate and that Biden is not legitimately our president potentially could create some long term issues, especially if this political divide widens and Republicans refuse to recognize Democratic presidents as legitimate, and likewise, if the Democrats respond and do not see Republican presidents as legitimate. I'll get off of our country for a while. I talked about this earlier. If a government loses its legitimacy, it often will attempt to maintain power through the coercive use of the military. I used the example when I talked about legitimacy earlier about the country of Iran. Certainly, the Shah of Iran for a quarter of a century used not only American military equipment, for example, in terms of keeping his country armed against hostile rivals like Iraq, but he also used American aid to have a very repressive security police and maintain political power for a quarter of a century until he was overthrown. I also gave you the example of our own country, where the American Revolution took place only after the colonists had a widespread perception that King George III was illegitimate, that he did not have the right to govern us. And I talked about the significance of the pamphlet Common Sense. The fall of governments in Eastern Europe occurred because they lacked legitimacy, because they were being propped up by the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union was unwilling to continue to prop up the governments of Eastern Europe, they fell very, very quickly. The third one is one that exists even in very developed societies sometimes, the crisis of penetration. By the crisis of penetration, what I mean is, are laws enforced? Do the policy decisions of the government trickle down to all levels of society? Or are there areas of the country in which the laws and policies of the regime do not apply? Some of you who took me for American government, and even if you took another instructor for American government, I'm sure you've heard of this case and this example. It's widespread. Uh, think about how American southern states refused to implement decisions of the Supreme Court regarding civil rights. And the most famous of these cases would be Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1954, by a 9-0 margin, so it was unanimous, said that public school segregation was illegal, it was unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court ruled that states must desegregate their public schools, quote, with all deliberate speed. Southern states essentially gave a middle finger to the national government. They refused to implement the Supreme Court ruling. In fact, 10 years went by, and in 1964, 98% of black school children in the Deep South still attended all black schools. So the policy decision, in this case of the Supreme Court, ruling that southern states could no longer segregate, was not enforced. The Supreme Court order did not trickle down to all levels of society, and the law of the land did not apply throughout the southern part of this country. So there have been other examples. You may remember in a history class talking about the Supreme Court ruling that Andrew Jackson did not have the power to relocate native tribes in the southeastern part of the United States to this new exotic place called Oklahoma. And in this particular case, the president said that John Marshall's made his decision, now let him enforce it. So Andrew Jackson disobeyed the Supreme Court ruling and relocated native peoples. So that's the crisis of penetration. The fourth is the crisis of participation. And here I believe that in our country we tend to only emphasize one of these, when in fact I believe that either could be a problem. Right? If the government has not extended the right of representation to gain compliance, there's a crisis of participation. Too little participation on a regular basis. We hear about allegations of voter suppression, that there are state governments that are trying to suppress voters. Certainly, if you go back to the days of segregation in the United States, one thing that was done to suppress voter participation was that voter registration places where you'd go register to vote. In many cases in towns, they would put these right next to a Ku Klux Klan headquarters, which, as you might imagine, would suppress the vote. There are states, and certainly Texas has been blamed for this, and whether you believe it or not is up to you, but certainly Texas has been under scrutiny as a place where there is an attempt to engage in voter suppression. And obviously, if that is occurring, if there is too little participation, it threatens the legitimacy of the system. But could the opposite be true? Could too much participation be harmful? And my feeling is absolutely. Because all political systems deal with scarcity. There are many demands that people have. Some people want infrastructure, some people want national defense, some people want more social welfare. People want a variety of different things, and the ability of the system to meet those demands is limited. I've always claimed that if suddenly there was a political revolution mentally in the United States and everyone became hyper political, the ability of the system to demand would be very, very limited. So I believe there can be a crisis of participation, too much or too little. In the United States, typically, when we've had this crisis, it has been too little participation. Now, the last crisis is the one that Gregory Mahler, and that's who I stole this section on, he claims this issue is ongoing, it's never resolved, that all countries deal with scarcity and some countries face more than others. Remember, if politics is about who gets what, when, and how, to use the path-breaking book that I referred to in a very early mini lecture by Harold Laswell, certainly the notion of who gets what, when, and how is a distribution issue. It essentially is saying that politics is about the distribution of resources in society. And certainly, if you take a look at the most fragile countries in the world, if you look at what might be the most visible problem of less developed countries, it's a material one. It's providing food and housing and water and electricity, which are often either insufficiently produced or, if they do exist, they're not equitably distributed. So certainly we've seen the ends of political systems because of this crisis of distribution. Certainly long food lines in Ethiopia was really the final straw, resulting in the eventual overthrow of Haile Selassie. Most political commentators believe that a lack of consumer goods in the Soviet Union was the primary factor leading Gorbachev to push for economic reforms, which eventually led to the implosion of the political regime. Your textbook author, Roskin, believes that the primary motivation for Gorbachev was not a distribution issue. Roskin is going to tell you when we get to the Russia chapter that he believes that it was technological backwardness, that the Soviet Union could no longer compete technologically with the United States given the economic system that they had. And so Gorbachev was wanting to reform the economic system to become more technologically efficient to compete with the West while maintaining a one-party monopoly under Soviet control, under the control of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. My concluding comment, it's not in the notes, is that think about it. Think about, even in a wealthy society like the United States, that there is a crisis of distribution of resources. For example, as I mentioned earlier, it's strange that an eighth of our people live in poverty in the United States, even though we're a powerful, wealthy nation. Because of this COVID crisis, there are an unprecedented number of people getting in line for food banks, for assistance. It's almost as if COVID has prompted a kind of a mini crisis. In California, for example, the wealthy have not been affected primarily economically by the COVID crisis. In fact, the capital gains for the wealthiest Californians has been outstanding. In fact, the wealth generated for the top has been so great that the California budget is going to run a surplus this year in the middle of COVID. And yet we have huge unemployment and poverty and basic needs shortages for those who are in poverty in California. So we do have a crisis of distribution even in the most affluent of societies.